Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to forge a nation, knowing one wrong move could erase it from history forever? It's a question that feels almost impossibly vast, but tonight we're going to explore it from the most intimate perspective imaginable, from the very own point of view of George Washington himself. It's wonderful to have you here with me as we begin our story. I'm always so curious, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you? It's always a pleasure to see our community settling in for a story from every corner of the globe. Wherever you are, I hope you're ready to get comfortable and let your mind drift back in time together. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we step into the shoes of George Washington, not as a monument, but as a man facing the monumental task of creating the American presidency. Our story begins right in the heart of the storm, on a rainy day in New York City, the nation's first capital. In the year 1789, a decision was made that was entirely without precedent in the young history of the United States. George Washington was elected president, not by a narrow margin or a contentious vote, but unanimously. Every single member of the Electoral College cast their ballot for him. This had never happened before, and it has never happened since. It was a staggering show of unity, a testament to the immense respect and trust the entire nation placed in this one man. Yet, for Washington, this unanimous decision was not a source of triumph. It was the source of a profound and heavy burden. His journey from his beloved home at Mount Vernon to the temporary capital in New York City was not a simple trip. It transformed almost immediately into a grand, week-long procession. In every town and village he passed through, the people poured out to greet him. They lined the roads for miles, their faces filled with hope and expectation. The air was constantly filled with sound, the boom of artillery salutes echoing across the fields, and the continuous roar of cheering crowds that followed his carriage like a great wave. It was a celebration, a national festival, but for the man at its center, it was a constant, crushing reminder of the hopes he was expected to fulfill. Behind the public spectacle, a private reality revealed the fragility of the new nation and its leader. The hero of the revolution, the man chosen by all to lead, was land-rich but cash-poor. His wealth was tied up in his Virginia estate, in fields and assets that could not easily be converted to currency. To even afford the journey to his own inauguration, to pay for his travel and expenses, Washington had to borrow money. A sum of £600 was loaned to him, a quiet, humbling transaction that underscored the immense personal sacrifice his public service demanded. He was about to become the head of a nation, yet he had to secure a loan just to be present for its birth. The day finally arrived, April 30th, 1789. The stage was set on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City. The city itself was a bustling, chaotic mix of the old and the new, a fitting backdrop for the unprecedented event about to unfold. Washington knew that every single detail of this day would be scrutinized. Every action, every word, every choice would set a precedent for the future of the presidency. He and the new Congress were inventing the traditions of a republic as they went, with the entire world watching their every move. His choice of clothing was his first silent but powerful statement. He deliberately avoided the silks, velvets, and elaborate dress of European royalty. There would be no hint of a monarch in his appearance. Instead, he chose a suit of simple brown broadcloth. As he dressed that morning, he might have felt the plain, slightly rough texture of the American-made fabric under his fingers. It was a conscious decision, a message to his people and to the world. This new government was of America, for America, built from its own resources and its own hard work. The suit was a symbol of Republican modesty and a promotion of domestic manufacturing. Stepping out onto the balcony, he was met with a breathtaking sight. Below him, the streets were a sea of people, a vast ocean of expectant faces, all looking up at him. The roar of the crowd was a physical force, a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. In that moment, he was the sole focus of a nation's collective hope. The weight of it all must have felt immense, almost unbearable. The ceremony itself was simple, yet laden with meaning. For the oath of office, a Bible was needed. One was hastily borrowed from the nearby St. John's Masonic Lodge, a heavy, well-worn volume. As he approached, it was opened to a randomly chosen page, Genesis chapter 49. Placing his hand upon the book, he could likely smell the musty, ancient scent of old paper and leather binding, a fragrance of history and tradition. As Chancellor Robert Livingston administered the oath, Washington repeated the sacred words, his voice steady despite the pressure. It is here that tradition and historical record softly diverge. It's widely believed, passed down through generations, that after reciting the official oath, Washington added 4 words of his own. So help me God. While historians debate the absolute certainty of this moment, it has become a foundational piece of the presidential story. A moment where the man sought divine guidance for the impossible task ahead. After the public oath, he stepped inside, away from the roaring crowds, to deliver his inaugural address to the members of Congress. The room was silent, the energy shifting from public spectacle to sober governance. It was in this quiet, formal setting that the immense strain on Washington became visible. His hands, which had so firmly held a sword through years of war, now trembled slightly as they held his speech. His voice, which had commanded armies, was low and almost hesitant. The monument was, for a moment, just a man, deeply aware of the fragility of the experiment he was now tasked to lead. He was nervous, and he was not afraid to show it. This new government was taking its first breaths, not in the grand city that would one day bear his name, but in the crowded, energetic streets of New York. It would later move to Philadelphia, another temporary home, before finally settling on the banks of the Potomac. And by his side, in the newly created role of vice president, was John Adams, a brilliant mind and a passionate patriot. Adams would be a crucial part of the new administration, though their relationship would begin with a formal, sometimes strained, sense of propriety. They were colleagues in a great endeavor, but not yet close confidants. With the oath taken and the first precedent set, Washington's monumental task was not to immediately pass a law or sign a treaty. His first real challenge was to assemble a team. He knew he could not govern alone. He needed the best minds the new nation had to offer, men of talent, vision, and experience. In seeking out these titans of intellect, he unknowingly set the stage for a political battle that would rage within his own administration, a conflict of ideas that would come to define his entire presidency. The United States Constitution, the very document Washington had sworn to uphold, is a masterpiece of structure and principle. Yet, it is surprisingly silent on the practical details of day-to-day governance. It says the president may require the opinion of the principal officers in the executive departments, but it never mentions the word cabinet. This concept of a council of advisors meeting regularly with the president was Washington's own innovation. it was another precedent, born of necessity, and his own collaborative style of leadership. He created a cabinet of just 4 members, a remarkably small circle to manage the affairs of an entire nation. For Secretary of War, he chose his trusted and loyal general from the Revolution, Henry Knox. For Attorney General, the nation's chief lawyer, he selected the thoughtful Edmund Randolph. But it was his other 2 choices that would transform these meetings into an intellectual crucible, a battleground for the very soul of the Republic. To be his Secretary of State, the nation's chief diplomat, Washington called upon Thomas Jefferson. At the time, Jefferson was serving as the United States Minister to France. He was immersed in the revolutionary fervor of Paris, a world of salons, philosophy, and radical ideas about liberty. He was, at first, reluctant to leave this post. He only accepted the position after returning to America in 1790, bringing with him a deep-seated belief in an agrarian republic. He envisioned America as a nation of independent yeoman farmers, a land of decentralized power where individual liberty was the highest virtue. He deeply feared a strong central government, viewing it as the first step on a well-trodden path to tyranny and monarchy. As Secretary of the Treasury, Washington made a profoundly different and equally brilliant choice. He selected Alexander Hamilton, a young, ambitious, and tireless genius. Hamilton had served as Washington's aide-de-camp during the war. He had seen firsthand how a weak central government under the Articles of Confederation had nearly cost them the victory. Hamilton's vision for America was the polar opposite of Jefferson's. He dreamed of a powerful, energetic nation with a robust central government that could foster a thriving economy based on commerce, manufacturing, and finance. He saw a future of bustling cities, powerful banks, and international trade. These 2 men were more than just political opponents. Their disagreement was fundamental, a clash of worldviews that quickly became deeply personal. In the charged atmosphere of the Capitol, they saw each other not as rivals, but as existential threats to the American experiment. Hamilton viewed Jefferson as a dangerous radical, a hypocritical slave-owning aristocrat who spoke of liberty while secretly admiring the chaos of the French Revolution. Jefferson, in turn, saw Hamilton as a crypto-monarchist, an enemy of freedom, who was secretly plotting to recreate the British system of corrupt, centralized power in America. The cabinet meetings themselves became the primary theater for this conflict. They were often held in the president's private study, a small, intimate room that made the tension feel even more concentrated. Imagine the scene. The low crackle of a fire in the hearth is the only sound that breaks the heavy silence. Washington sits at the head of the table, tall and imposing, his face a mask of stern neutrality as he listens to his secretaries. The air itself feels thick with unspoken animosity, a physical presence in the room. Then the debate would begin. Hamilton, ever the energetic advocate, would speak in a torrent of rapid, passionate arguments, his words weaving complex financial and political theories into a compelling case for his vision. Opposite him, Jefferson would respond with a calm, measured tone. His arguments were just as firm, rooted in philosophy and a deep distrust of what he saw as Hamilton's power grabs. The sound of their voices, one sharp and quick, the other deliberate and cool, filled the room. Adding to the dynamic, Henry Knox, the stolid Secretary of War, often sided with Hamilton's pragmatic arguments. Edmund Randolph, the Attorney General, frequently tried to find a middle ground, a position that ultimately left him isolated and frustrated both factions. Washington's role in these meetings was that of a referee, a judge, and a father figure. He would listen intently to both sides, weighing their brilliant but utterly incompatible arguments. He was the calm center of a storm of his own creation, constantly trying to harness the genius of his cabinet without letting their mutual animosity tear the government apart. It was from this fiery clash of titans, this fundamental disagreement over the very nature and purpose of the United States, that the first American political parties were born. Hamilton's supporters became known as the Federalists, while Jefferson, along with his close ally James Madison, founded the Democratic Republicans. The philosophical war between his two key secretaries soon erupted into open conflict over the most pressing issue facing the new nation: its staggering debt. It was here Hamilton would make his boldest move. The new United States was born into a world of debt. The price of liberty, won through 8 long years of war, was now coming due. The nation was, to put it simply, broke and on the verge of financial collapse. The federal government owed a staggering $54 million, while the individual states collectively owed another $25 million. In the late 18th century, these were astronomical, almost unimaginable sums of money. The nation's credit was in ruins, its future hanging by a thread. Into this financial crisis stepped Alexander Hamilton. In 1790, he presented his report on the public credit to Congress. It was a document as bold and audacious as the man himself. His plan was radical. He proposed that the new federal government should assume, or take over, all the remaining war debts of the individual states. His logic was twofold and brilliant. First, by paying these debts, the government would establish its creditworthiness on the world stage, proving to foreign powers that the United States was a reliable and stable nation. Second, and perhaps more importantly, it would bind the wealthy creditors of each state directly to the success of the federal government. If they wanted their money back, they would need the new nation to survive and thrive. The proposal ignited a political firestorm. The opposition was immediate, fierce, and led by James Madison in Congress, with Thomas Jefferson providing the philosophical ammunition from the cabinet. The heart of the opposition came from the southern states, especially Virginia, the home of both Jefferson and Madison. Many of these states, through great effort, had already paid off most of their war debts. From their perspective, Hamilton's plan was nothing more than a bailout for the northern states, who had been less fiscally responsible. They saw it as being forced to pay the same debt twice, a deeply unfair proposition. Furthermore, Madison raised a powerful moral objection. During the war, the government had paid its soldiers and suppliers with bonds, which were essentially IOUs. In the desperate years after the war, many of these poor veterans had sold their bonds to wealthy speculators for just pennies on the dollar, needing immediate cash to survive. Madison argued that Hamilton's plan would now reward these very speculators, paying them the full face value of the bonds, while the original patriotic soldiers who had bled for the country would get nothing. The debate raged in the halls of Congress for months, growing more bitter and personal with each passing day. The rustle of countless pamphlets and angry newspaper articles could be heard in taverns and coffeehouses across the country. Impassioned, booming speeches echoed through the legislative chambers, and the threat of secession, of the southern states breaking away from the Union, felt terrifyingly real. The entire American experiment was on the verge of collapsing over a financial dispute. It was in this moment of crisis that one of the most famous compromises in American history was struck, not in the halls of Congress, but over a quiet dinner Jefferson, hoping to break the deadlock, hosted a private meeting with Hamilton and Madison. Imagine the scene: a small, private room, the table set for three. The only light comes from the soft glow of candles, glinting off the surfaces of the wine glasses. In this intimate setting, these three fierce rivals laid the future of the nation on the table. The bargain they struck was a masterpiece of political horse trading. Hamilton, the New Yorker, needed Southern votes for his debt plan. Jefferson and Madison, the Virginians, deeply desired for the nation's permanent capital to be located in the South, away from the northern centers of finance and commerce they so distrusted. The deal was made. Hamilton agreed to use his considerable influence to persuade northern congressmen to vote for moving the capital to a site on the Potomac River. In exchange, Madison agreed to secure just enough Southern votes to allow Hamilton's debt assumption plan to pass. This dinner-table bargain saved the Union. It led directly to the passage of the Residence Act of 1790. This act designated Philadelphia as the temporary capital for a period of 10 years, providing time for the new federal city, which would one day be named Washington, D.C., to be built. And crucially, it allowed for the passage of Hamilton's financial plan, which put the United States on the path to economic stability. As a second and equally contentious part of his grand design, Hamilton also successfully pushed for the creation of the first bank of the United States. This national bank, he argued, was essential for managing the nation's finances. Jefferson, naturally, argued fiercely that it was an unconstitutional overreach of federal power. The battle was won by Hamilton, but the war of ideas would continue. While Washington skillfully navigated the financial and political battles raging within his own government, a far more direct and violent challenge to its authority was brewing on the western frontier. It was a challenge that would grow from a simmer to a boil, a rebellion that would force the president to make a choice no American leader had ever made before. A choice that would define the very power of the office he held, to help pay off the very debts Alexander Hamilton had worked so hard to consolidate. His financial plan included a new source of federal revenue. In 1791, at his strong urging, Congress passed an excise tax on distilled spirits. On the surface, it seemed like a reasonable measure. In reality, it lit a fuse on the volatile western frontier of Pennsylvania. For the small farmers living in this remote, rugged region, whiskey was not merely a drink. It was the lifeblood of their economy. Transporting bulky crops of grain like corn and rye over the poorly maintained mountain roads to eastern markets was difficult and expensive. Distilling that grain into whiskey, however, made it compact, stable, and far more valuable. Whiskey became a medium of exchange, a form of currency used to barter for goods and pay for services. The federal excise tax, therefore, was not seen as a tax on a luxury item. It was seen as a direct attack on their livelihood. The tax also disproportionately affected them. Large distillers in the East could afford to pay the tax annually at a flat rate. Small, frontier producers, however, were taxed by the gallon, a system that felt deeply unjust and targeted them specifically. Protests began almost immediately. At first, it took the form of tax evasion and public resolutions, but the spirit of defiance, so recently celebrated in the American Revolution, quickly escalated. The farmers of western Pennsylvania began to see the federal tax collectors as they had once seen the British. They were agents of a distant, tyrannical power, infringing upon their liberties. Harassment of tax officials became common. those who dared to cooperate with the government found their barns burned and their stills destroyed. The situation reached its breaking point in the summer of 1794, when a federal marshal arrived to serve writs to farmers who had not paid the tax. He was met by an armed mob. A shootout occurred, and a prominent rebel leader was killed. In response, a furious force of around 7,000 local militiamen gathered near Pittsburgh. The acrid smell of wood smoke from a tax collector's torched home hung heavy in the air. The rebels, feeling their power, threatened to march on the city, a direct and open insurrection against the laws of the United States. For President Washington, this was the ultimate test. The fragile new government, which had struggled for its very existence in the halls of Congress, now faced an armed rebellion. Would the Republic prove to be nothing more than a suggestion, a government whose laws could be ignored with impunity? Washington, guided by the insistent counsel of Hamilton, knew he had to act decisively. He invoked the Militia Act of 1792, a law that gave the president the authority to call up the state militias to enforce federal law. He assembled a massive force, an army of nearly 13,000 men, drawn from several states, a force larger than the one he had often commanded during the Revolution. Then, Washington made a decision that was truly without precedent. At the age of 62, the sitting President of the United States announced he would personally lead the army into the field. He put on his old military uniform one last time. The sight of him, aged but still powerful and imposing, mounted on his horse, his face set with grim determination, was a powerful message to the entire nation. The rhythmic sound of thousands of marching feet and the jingle of military equipment filled the autumn air as the federalized militia moved west towards Pennsylvania. The president himself was riding at their head. The overwhelming show of force worked exactly as Washington and Hamilton had intended. As the massive army crossed the mountains, the rebellion simply melted away. There was no climactic battle, no great confrontation. The rebels, faced with the undeniable power and resolve of the federal government, dispersed. The Whiskey Rebellion collapsed with almost no bloodshed. A few of the leaders were arrested, and 2 were convicted of treason. But in a final act of wisdom, Washington later pardoned them both, showing that the government could be merciful as well as strong. The event was a pivotal moment. It firmly established the federal government's authority, proving that it had the power and the will to enforce its laws within the states. The frontier farmers might have lost their battle over the tax, but the United States had won a crucial victory for the principle of national unity and the rule of law. It was a crucial, powerful precedent for the future of the young republic. Having proven the strength and resolve of the new government in the face of rebellion, Washington could now turn his attention from the constant drumbeat of crisis management to a more deliberate and lasting task, shaping the very culture and home of the republic he had fought so hard to create and preserve. It's incredible to think about the sheer pressure of those first few years. If you were in Washington's position, who would you have trusted more? The brilliant pragmatist, Hamilton, or the idealistic philosopher, Jefferson? Let me know your thoughts as we move from the battlefield of politics to the quiet craft of building a nation. Having proven the strength and resolve of the new government, Washington could now turn his attention from the battlefield of politics to a more deliberate and lasting task. There was no guidebook for being president, no manual to consult. Every tradition, every ceremony, and every social custom had to be invented from scratch. He was not just the head of state, he was the chief architect of the American presidency itself. and he approached the task with the same meticulous care he had once used to survey the Virginia wilderness. One of the very first questions was startlingly simple, yet deeply profound. What should the president be called? A Senate committee, perhaps still enamored with European traditions, proposed a grand and lengthy title. They suggested His Highness the President of the United States of America, and protector of their liberties. The title was cumbersome, and to many, it sounded far too much like the language of monarchy. Washington, who was deeply concerned with what he called Republican simplicity, was uncomfortable with such pageantry. After much debate, the grand title was rejected in favor of the simple, elegant, and enduring address that is still used today. Mr. President. With his title settled, Washington faced a more practical problem. His time was a national resource, and it was being consumed by an endless stream of visitors, office seekers, and well-wishers who came to call at all hours. To bring order to this chaos, he established a series of formal weekly gatherings. On Tuesday afternoons, from 3 to 4, he would host a levee for men. These were not casual parties. The atmosphere was formal, almost silent, broken only by polite murmurs and the sound of Washington's own low voice. Guests, a collection of congressmen, diplomats, and other dignitaries, would arrive in their finest formal attire. The room would be a sea of powdered wigs, silk stockings, and buckled shoes. They would arrange themselves in a circle, and on the dot, the president would enter. He would proceed around the room, bowing formally to each man. He did not shake hands, a custom, he felt, was too familiar for the dignity of the office. He would exchange a few quiet words with each guest, and then, after completing the circle, he would bow once to the entire room and depart as formally as he had arrived. Not everyone was impressed. Some, like the sharp-tongued Senator William Maclay of Pennsylvania, criticized these events as being too stiff, too cold, and far too similar to the royal courts of Europe. Maclay saw in the formal bows and lack of physical contact an imitation of king-like behavior, a betrayal of Republican values. But Washington saw it differently. He understood that these rituals were not about him as a man. They were about establishing respect and legitimacy for the office he held. The presidency had to be seen as dignified and serious, an institution worthy of both domestic and international respect. To balance this formal masculinity, Martha Washington hosted her own weekly receptions. These gatherings, held on Friday evenings, were far more relaxed and social. Here, both men and women were welcome. The conversations were lighter, laughter could be heard, and a sense of warmth filled the presidential residence. These receptions, managed with grace by the First Lady, showed a softer, more accessible side of the presidency. State dinners were another tool Washington used to build the nation's prestige. These were elaborate affairs, carefully orchestrated to showcase American hospitality. The tables were laden with the best of American produce, from Virginia ham to fish from New England rivers. The clinking of fine silverware and crystal glasses provided a gentle soundtrack to the formal conversation. The air would be filled with the pleasant scents of beeswax candles and roasted meats wafting from the kitchens. Every detail, from the seating chart to the strict rules of etiquette, was designed to impress upon foreign diplomats and domestic politicians that this new nation was stable, orderly, and sophisticated. Washington was always meticulous about his own appearance. He was always impeccably dressed, often with a ceremonial dress, sword at his side. Another detail that drew criticism from his detractors. When he traveled through the streets of Philadelphia, the temporary capital, he did so in a grand, cream-colored coach drawn by 6 perfectly matched horses. It was a spectacle, designed to inspire a sense of awe and public respect for the new government. He believed the people needed to see the presidency as something more than just another political office. It had to be a symbol of the nation itself. These social protocols, so carefully crafted and debated, would set the standard for official life in the capital for generations to come. While Washington was carefully constructing the social identity of the presidency in the bustling city of Philadelphia, an even more ambitious construction project was taking shape on the banks of the Potomac. It was a project born from a political compromise, a grand vision of a brand new capital city rising directly from the wilderness. The Residence Act of July 1790 was the legal fulfillment of the famous dinner table bargain, struck between Hamilton and Jefferson. It officially authorized the president to select a 10-mile square of land somewhere along the Potomac River to become the permanent seat of the United States government. For Washington, this was not just a political directive, it was a deeply personal mission. He was more familiar with this stretch of river than perhaps any other man in America. He had traversed its banks and explored its creeks in his youth as a surveyor. His beloved home, Mount Vernon, was just a short ride away. This was his home territory. He personally rode out on horseback, time and again, to survey the terrain. With his commissioners at his side, he would point out key locations, his experienced eye seeing not what was there, but what could be. He selected the exact location, a stretch of land ceded by the states of Maryland and Virginia. What he chose was not a pristine landscape ready for development. It was a rugged, undeveloped patch of earth. The area was mostly a collection of farms, dense woods, and humid marshland. The summer air was thick and heavy, and the nights were filled with the constant sound of chirping insects and croaking frogs from the swamps. The dominant settlements were the small, established port towns of Georgetown in Maryland and Alexandria in Virginia. The future capital was, for all intents and purposes, a wilderness. The ambitious project was initially known simply as the Federal City. It was the commissioners in 1791 who officially named the city Washington in his honor, and named the surrounding territory Columbia, a poetic name for the nation. Washington himself never referred to the city by his own name. He believed a grand capital was absolutely essential. It would be a powerful, physical symbol of the permanence and strength of the new nation. It would show the skeptical world, especially the old powers of Europe, that the United States was here to stay. The process was fraught with challenges. The government owned the land that would become the streets, but all the lots for buildings had to be purchased from the 19 original landowners of the area. This required delicate and often frustrating negotiations. Financing the entire project was a constant, desperate struggle. The government had very little money, and the development relied on the sale of city lots and public lotteries. These were often unsuccessful, and the project teetered on the brink of financial collapse multiple times. The smell of damp earth and thick foliage filled the air as the first surveyors began to cut paths through the dense woods, laying the groundwork for a future metropolis. From across the Atlantic, many Europeans watched this endeavor with deep skepticism. They saw it as a foolish, grandiose dream. The idea of building a monumental capital city in the middle of a swamp seemed absurd. They mockingly called it the capital in the wilderness, fully expecting the project to fail and be swallowed back up by the forest. But they underestimated the vision and the sheer determination of the man for whom it would be named. He saw a future that they could not, looking across the wide, slow-moving Potomac River and feeling a sense of vast, undeveloped potential. With the land secured, the immense and thrilling task of designing the city began. Washington was not a passive observer in this process. He was its driving force. Having spent his early years as a surveyor, he possessed a keen and practical eye for landscape, topography, and architecture. This was a passion project for him, a chance to shape not just a government, but the physical environment where that government would live and grow. To bring this grand vision to life, he hired a man of immense talent and a notoriously difficult personality. His name was Peter Charles L'Enfant, a French artist and engineer who had served with distinction in the Continental Army and had earned Washington's respect. L'Enfant was tasked with creating the master plan for the new federal city. What he produced was nothing short of genius. His plan was Baroque in its ambition, inspired by the great capitals of Europe. It featured a logical grid of streets, but overlaid this grid with a breathtaking network of grand diagonal avenues, circles, and sprawling public squares, all designed to create dramatic vistas and a sense of monumental scale. You can imagine L'Enfant's grand, sprawling map laid out on a large table, the clean, sharp smell of fresh ink on the paper filling the room. Washington and his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, would peer over it, discussing every detail. Both men, deeply interested in architecture and city planning, provided L'Enfant with maps of European cities they admired, places like Paris, Amsterdam, and Milan, to serve as inspiration. The plan was brilliant, centering on two key symbolic buildings. The Congress House, which would become the Capitol, was placed on a high hill. The President's House, the future White House, was situated on another prominent piece of land. A grand avenue would connect them, a physical link between the legislative and executive branches. But L'Enfant's genius was matched only by his arrogance. He was notoriously difficult to work with. Viewing the three commissioners Washington had appointed to oversee the project as his inferiors, he refused to take their orders, constantly exceeded his authority, and acted as if he were the sole creator of the city. The sound of heated arguments, in a mix of French and English, often erupted between the proud artist and the frustrated commissioners. The conflict came to a head over a house. Daniel Carroll, a powerful local landowner and nephew of one of the commissioners, was building a large new home. Unfortunately for him, its location obstructed the path of one of L'Enfant's planned grand avenues. Without seeking proper authority, L'Enfant simply had the house demolished. The act was an outrageous display of insubordination. It created a political firestorm that Washington could not ignore. As the city's grand layout took shape on paper and in the muddy fields of the Potomac, the focus turned to its two anchor points. One was the Grand House for Congress. The other was the residence for the nation's chief executive. For the office Washington was so carefully crafting, the president's house was of supreme importance. It had to be a building that projected dignity and strength, yet avoided the opulent trappings of a royal palace. To ensure a design worthy of the new republic, a public competition was held. An advertisement called for designs for both the Capitol and the President's House, offering a prize of $500 and a city lot to the winner. It was a democratic and open process, inviting architects from all over the nation to submit their vision. Even Thomas Jefferson, a skilled amateur architect, submitted a design for the president's house. He did so anonymously, but his classical, temple-like design was not chosen. The winning entry came from an Irish-born architect named James Hoban. His design was elegant and stately, modeled on Leinster House, a grand ducal palace in his native Dublin. Washington personally reviewed and approved Hoban's drawings. However, ever conscious of the need for the office to command respect, he felt the initial design was too modest. He insisted that the plans be enlarged by about 20%, adding more grand and ornamental features to give the building the stature he believed it required. On October 13, 1792, the cornerstone for the president's house was laid in a simple Masonic ceremony. The construction site soon became a bustling hub of activity. The rhythmic, sharp chink-chink of stonemasons' chisels became a constant sound, echoing across the fields. The building was constructed from a pale, cream-colored sandstone, quarried from Aquia Creek in Virginia. It was this stone that would eventually give the building its famous nickname, the White House. The air at the site was thick with the smell of fresh sawdust and curing mortar, and the gritty feel of sandstone dust seemed to coat everything in the vicinity. Massive foundation stones were hauled into place by teams of oxen and laborers. It was difficult, grueling work, and it is a crucial and uncomfortable part of our history that much of this labor was performed by enslaved African Americans. They worked alongside European immigrants, particularly skilled stonemasons from Scotland, to slowly bring the grand vision to life. From the temporary capital in Philadelphia, Washington oversaw the entire project. He corresponded regularly with the commissioners and with Hoban, keeping a close eye on every detail of the construction. And yet, in a poignant turn of history, George Washington is the only president who never lived in the White House. The building was not completed during his time in office. The first president to occupy it was his successor, John Adams, who moved into the still unfinished structure in the raw new Capitol in November of 0800. Washington's vision was for a home that was stately and dignified, but not an opulent palace. It was a physical reflection of the Republic itself, strong, respectable, and built to endure. The vision of that grand, white building slowly rising from the mud and chaos of the construction site was a powerful symbol of the nation he was building. The laying of these stone foundations was deeply symbolic. Washington had now built the political foundations of the presidency, and he was overseeing the construction of its physical foundations. He had weathered political storms, faced down rebellion, and was now creating a capital city from nothing. But this grand public service, this complete devotion to the creation of a nation, came at a great personal cost, a burden he felt more and more heavily with each passing day. Building a capital from scratch seems like such an immense undertaking. If you could design a new city, what one feature would you make sure it had? Ponder that as we turn from the grand public stage to the private inner world of the man himself. He had done it. He had navigated the storms, built the foundations, and then, most importantly, he had walked away, proving the Republic was stronger than any one person. The second term of his presidency was not a victory lap. The era of unanimous praise, the honeymoon period of a nation united behind its hero, was long over. In its place, a new and aggressive political culture had taken root. Partisan newspapers, funded and encouraged by figures on both sides of the growing divide, like Hamilton and Jefferson, had emerged, and their primary target was the president himself. The attacks were relentless, personal, and vicious. Washington, the man who had been revered as the father of his country, was now routinely caricatured in print. Imagine him in the quiet of his study, the low flickering light of a single candle casting long shadows on the wall. As he works late into the night, he picks up a newspaper, and the soft rustle of the page is the only sound. There, he sees his own face twisted into a cruel cartoon, or reads an article accusing him of the very things he despised. He was labeled an aristocrat, a secret monarchist who longed to be a king. He was even accused of financial impropriety, a sting that deeply wounded his profound sense of personal honor. In 1795, a treaty negotiated with Great Britain, known as the Jay Treaty, proved to be deeply unpopular with the public. It was seen by many as a betrayal of revolutionary principles, a capitulation to the old enemy. Public protests erupted in cities across the nation. In the ultimate act of political scorn, Washington, the hero of the revolution, was burned in effigy. Mobs in the streets were cheering as a likeness of their president was consumed by flames. He complained bitterly in a private letter, writing that he was being attacked in such exaggerated and indecent terms as could scarcely be applied to a Nero, a notorious defaulter, or even to a common pickpocket. The feeling of exhaustion settled deep into his bones after each long day of meetings, correspondence, and ceaseless decision-making. He also felt increasingly isolated. The political divisions he had feared so much were now a reality, and they had fractured his personal relationships. Old friendships, forged in the crucible of the revolution, became strained or were broken entirely by the bitterness of partisan politics. His relationship with Thomas Jefferson, once a trusted member of his cabinet, had grown cold and distant. The quiet, heavy silence of the president's house. After all, the aides and petitioners had gone home for the night, must have felt profound. Through it all, the demands of the office were relentless. They left him with little time for his personal affairs, and even less for his one true passion, his beloved estate, Mount Vernon. He received weekly reports that his farms were struggling in his absence, another source of private anxiety. He felt trapped, caught between his duty and his deepest desires. Public expectation had cast him as the indispensable man, the only one who could hold the fragile nation together. This period saw him age visibly. The portraits painted during his second term show a man transformed by the weight of his office. The energetic and commanding general of the first term was gone. In his place was a much more tired, stern-faced man, his features etched with the lines of worry and profound weariness. Yet, despite the private pain and the public attacks, he maintained a stoic and dignified facade. He believed, with every fiber of his being, that this was essential for the stability of the office he had created. To truly understand George Washington, the man, you must look past the battlefield and the presidential residence, and turn your gaze to the rolling hills of Virginia. It was at Mount Vernon that his heart truly resided. He referred to himself, first and foremost, as a farmer. It was his core identity. He considered his life at Mount Vernon his true and highest calling, the work he was always meant to do. The presidency was a duty, but farming was his passion. While serving as president in the bustling capitals of New York and Philadelphia, he remained the active manager of his 8,000-acre estate. He governed Mount Vernon from afar through a remarkable series of detailed weekly letters to his farm manager. He gave precise instructions on everything from planting schedules to the proper way to build a new fence. In his personal letters to friends and family, a deep sense of homesickness and weariness is a constant theme. He wrote often of the drudgery of his office and of his ardent wishes to return to the shade of private life. He dreamed of a peaceful retirement, a dream he often described using a favorite biblical phrase. He longed for the day when he could sit under his own vine and fig tree, a simple, beautiful image of a man at peace on his own land, with no one to make him afraid. Mount Vernon was far more than just a home or a plantation. It was a laboratory for agricultural innovation. Washington was a keen and forward-thinking farmer, constantly experimenting with new techniques. He pioneered methods of crop rotation to preserve the health of the soil. He experimented with different types of fertilizers, meticulously recording the results. He was a designer and an architect in his own right, creating many of the outbuildings on the estate himself. His most famous creation was an innovative 16-sided treading barn, a unique design that allowed for the efficient processing of wheat. It is remarkable that his letters show more passion, more energy, and far more detail when he is discussing these agricultural matters than almost any political topic. He would write with great enthusiasm about the market price of wheat or a new design for a plow. It was expensive to maintain, and in his absence, it was not as profitable as he needed it to be. The thought of his beloved farm struggling was another weight upon his already burdened shoulders. What he missed most were the simple routines of his life on the estate. He missed the familiar feel of the smooth, worn wood of his desk in his personal study. He missed the comfortable quiet of the evenings, a quiet broken only by the gentle sounds of the Virginia countryside, the imagined scent of freshly turned earth in the fields, the gentle sound of the Potomac River flowing at the edge of his property, the glorious sight of the sun setting over the hills, viewed from his long porch. These were the simple, profound pleasures he had sacrificed for public service. This deep and genuine desire for retirement was not a political maneuver. It was the honest yearning of a tired man who wanted nothing more than to go home. It was this longing that set the stage for his final and perhaps greatest act as president. As the end of his second term drew near in 1796, Washington knew the time had finally come. His longing for Mount Vernon was too strong to ignore, and he was convinced that the nation was now stable enough to survive without him. But he could not simply walk away. He felt a deep paternal responsibility to leave the nation with one final piece of advice, a distillation of the wisdom he had gained through a long life of service. He decided to formalize his departure in a document that would become one of the most famous and influential in American history, his farewell address. The idea for such an address was not new. At the end of his first term, when he had seriously considered retiring, he had asked his close advisor. Over several months, Hamilton wrote a series of new drafts, building on Madison's original ideas and adding his own powerful insights. Washington then took all of these materials and, with the scratchy sound of his quill pen, he edited and reworked them, creating the final version that was uniquely his own. This monumental address was not a spoken speech. On September 19, 1796, the text appeared in the pages of the American Daily Advertiser, a Philadelphia newspaper. The smell of fresh ink on the newsprint carried his final words to the nation. The publication caused an immediate sensation. In taverns and public squares, people would gather as one person read the address aloud to a hushed and attentive crowd. The address contained a series of powerful warnings, born from his own difficult experiences. His most famous warning was against the dangers of political parties, or factions, as he called them. He had seen firsthand how the rivalry between Hamilton and Jefferson had nearly torn his own government apart. He believed that the spirit of party would lead to endless division, distract the government from its duties, and ultimately open the door to despotism. He also offered timeless advice on foreign policy. He argued that the young nation should remain neutral in the constant conflicts of Europe, focusing instead on peaceful commercial relations with all countries. The address powerfully defends the importance of the federal union, warning against the dangers of sectionalism, of pitting North against South or East against West, and it stresses the importance of religion, morality. This was not required by the Constitution, but was a conscious choice. By stepping down, he was setting a crucial precedent, establishing a tradition that would guide the presidency for the next 150 years. The weighty feel of the final manuscript must have felt like a great burden being lifted from his shoulders. As he gave his final approval to the text in the quiet contemplation of his study, he was preparing to give his country its final lesson. The news of his departure was met with a mix of emotions across the land. There was sadness that their great leader was leaving, but also a profound sense of admiration for his wisdom and his humility. With his parting words now delivered to the nation, only one final act remained. It was an act that required no armies, no new laws, and no grand construction projects. He would simply and peacefully give up his power. The election of 1796 was a bitter and hard-fought contest, the first truly contested presidential election in the nation's history. Washington's vice president, John Adams, representing the Federalists, defeated his old rival, Thomas Jefferson, of the Democratic Republicans. Under the rules of the time, the runner-up became the new vice president. This created the awkward and tense situation of having a president and vice president from two opposing parties, a sign of the deep divisions Washington had warned about. The day of the inauguration was March 4th, 1797. The ceremony was to take place in the hall of the House of Representatives in Congress Hall in Philadelphia. George Washington, the most powerful and revered man in America, attended the ceremony. But he did not come in his military uniform, nor in the formal dress of the presidency. He arrived in a simple suit of black velvet. His choice of clothing was a quiet but powerful statement. He was no longer General Washington or President Washington. He was, once again, Citizen Washington. The chamber was crowded, the air thick with a palpable feeling of history being made. John Adams, his successor and old friend, stepped forward to take the oath of office. The solemn sound of Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth administering the oath filled the silent room. As Adams spoke the words, eyewitnesses in the crowd looked over at Washington. They reported that the great man, famous for his stoic self-control, was visibly and deeply moved. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the glimmer of tears on his cheeks as he watched power pass from his hands to another. His emotion was shared by the audience. Many in the crowd were also openly weeping. It was not just sadness at his departure, it was a profound sense of awe. They were witnessing something truly unprecedented. A leader who had led an army to victory and had been given supreme power was now voluntarily and peacefully giving it all away. They were watching the birth of a new kind of power, a power rooted not in a man, but in the law. A collective sigh and the sound of muffled sobs could be heard throughout the room. After the ceremony was over, Washington left the hall. As he stepped outside, the cool March air on his face must have felt like the first breath of a new life. He was no longer president, but a private citizen once more. As he began to walk home, the crowds that had gathered outside did not cheer. This single, peaceful act was seen around the world as truly revolutionary. Years before, his great rival, King George III of England, had been asked what he thought Washington would do after the war. The king predicted he would stay in power. When told that Washington planned to return to his farm, the king was said to have replied, "He had established the peaceful transfer of power as the unshakable cornerstone of American democracy." A few days later, George Washington left Philadelphia for the last time, his coach finally turning south on the long road home to his beloved Mount Vernon. And so, the story of George Washington's presidency concludes not with a battle or a grand monument, but with a quiet, revolutionary act of letting go. He proved that true leadership isn't about holding on to power, but in knowing when and how to pass it on. He had weathered the rebellions, refereed the titans in his cabinet, and laid the foundations of a capital city, all to create an office strong enough to survive his own departure. Thank you for joining me on this core part of our journey tonight. I hope it has been a relaxing and insightful look into the birth of the American Republic. If you're still with me, I'd love to know what part of his story resonated with you the most. As you ponder that, let your mind continue to drift as we reflect on the lasting echoes of his presidency. The precedents Washington set were like quiet seeds planted in the soil of a new republic, which grew into the mighty trees that support its structure today. His choices, made under immense pressure and with no guide to follow, still echo in the halls of power. Thank you for staying with me to explore these gentle reflections. As you continue to unwind, let's drift even further back to explore some of the fascinating details and side stories that surrounded this remarkable life. Let us begin this gentle reflection with the quiet rustling of autumn leaves outside a window. The sound is a soft whisper, a reminder that seasons change, that all things have their time, and that even the most vital periods of leadership must come to a peaceful and natural end. This was the spirit behind what is perhaps George Washington's most powerful and enduring precedent, the two-term tradition. When the framers gathered in Philadelphia to write the Constitution, they created the office of the presidency with great care, but they left one significant question unanswered. They placed no term limits on the office. According to the letter of the law, once elected, a president could run for re-election again and again and again. A popular and successful leader could, in theory, serve for their entire life. As Washington neared the end of his second term in 1796, many Americans not only expected him to run again, they deeply wanted him to. In the eyes of his countrymen and the world, he was the indispensable man, the singular figure who held the fragile Union together. The idea of him stepping down felt, to many, like a dangerous risk. They would have gladly kept him in office for life, a sort of elected monarch, a benevolent father guiding the nation until his final days. But Washington saw this possibility not as an honor, but as a profound danger. His entire public life had been a struggle against the very idea of monarchy. He had led an army against a king, and he was determined that the republic they had built would never, ever resemble one. His decision to voluntarily step down, to walk away from the pinnacle of power, was a conscious and deliberate choice. It was a lesson in republican virtue, a clear statement that the power of the office did not belong to him or to any single individual. It belonged to the people, and it was meant to be passed peacefully from one hand to another. It was like watching a torch in a long relay, its flame burning brightly. The goal is not for one runner to hold it forever, but to pass it securely to the next, so the light may continue on its journey. The slow, steady ticking of a grandfather clock in a quiet hall marks the passage of time, not in a chaotic or violent rush, but in a predictable, orderly, and peaceful succession. This was the principle Washington sought to establish. His act did not stand alone. 8 years later, the nation's third president, Thomas Jefferson, followed his example. After serving 2 successful terms, Jefferson also chose to retire, explicitly citing Washington's precedent as his guide. This act solidified the unwritten rule. It transformed Washington's personal choice into a sacred democratic tradition. For the next century and a half, the 2-term limit was respected by every single president who followed. It became a cornerstone of American political life, a principle as powerful as any written law. One can almost feel the calm of reading a well-worn history book by the soft glow of candlelight, turning the pages and seeing this tradition honored time and time again, a quiet testament to a founder's wisdom. This gentle rhythm of change, this peaceful succession of power, continued uninterrupted for over 150 years. It was only broken by a crisis of unprecedented scale. In 1940, with the world descending into the darkness of the Second World War, and the nation still recovering from the Great Depression, Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to run for a 3rd term. He won, and in 1944, with the war still raging, he was elected to a 4th. The unique and terrifying circumstances of the time were seen as justification for breaking with tradition. But the break made many Americans deeply uncomfortable. It raised old fears about the dangers of prolonged, centralized power. In the aftermath of the war and Roosevelt's death, a movement began to formalize the tradition that Washington had begun. The nation decided that this unwritten rule was too important to be left to chance. In 1951, the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution was ratified. It formally and legally limits a president to 2 elected terms. With that act, Washington's voluntary choice, his quiet gift to the Republic, became the mandatory law of the land. It is a lasting tribute, a final acknowledgement that his wisdom was timeless. This tradition, now enshrined in the Constitution, is seen as a vital safeguard against the potential for tyranny. It ensures that the office of the president remains a temporary post, not a permanent possession. It is a testament to the powerful idea of a citizen leader, a person who rises from the people to serve, and then quietly returns to them. It reflects Washington's deepest and most abiding belief that the long-term health and stability of the Republic would always be more important than the continued service of any single individual, no matter how indispensable they might seem. Beyond the length of his service, even the very name of his office became a quiet echo of his character, a lasting reflection of his belief in Republican simplicity. Let us now reflect on the debate over a title, a choice that seems small, but which was crucial in defining the very nature of the American presidency. Imagine, for a moment, an ornate, gilded throne, heavy with jewels and elaborate carvings. It is a seat of immense power, designed to inspire awe and to separate the ruler from the ruled. Now, picture a simple, sturdy wooden chair. It is well made, solid, and dignified, but it is a seat of service, not of majesty. This was the choice facing the new nation. Would its leader occupy a throne or a chair? In the first uncertain months of the new government, this question was a subject of serious and formal debate. A committee was formed in the Senate, tasked with the seemingly simple job of recommending an official title for the president. The man who chaired this committee was Vice President John Adams. Adams was a brilliant patriot, but he also believed that for the new nation to be taken seriously on the world stage, its leader needed a title that projected grandeur and commanded respect. He looked at the kings and emperors of Europe, and he worried that a simple title would make the American president seem weak or insignificant in comparison. After much deliberation, the Senate committee proposed its official recommendation. The title they suggested was His Highness the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties. It was a grand, flowing, and deeply controversial title. To modern ears, it sounds almost comical, but at the time, it was a serious proposal. It was an attempt to cloak the new office in the same kind of pomp and ceremony that surrounded European monarchs. However, the House of Representatives, led by the thoughtful and Republican-minded James Madison, reacted with alarm. They saw in this title the very thing they had fought a revolution to escape. The words His Highness and Protector sounded far too much like the language of a royal court. They argued that such a title was contrary to the spirit of the new Constitution and the character of the American people. They insisted on the simple, direct title that was already written in the Constitution itself, President of the United States. A deadlock ensued between the two houses of Congress. The Senate pushed for its grand title, while the House refused to budge from its position of simple dignity. Through all of this, George Washington remained publicly silent, but he quietly made his own preference known to his allies. He was deeply uncomfortable with the pompous suggestions. He felt that such titles were not only foolish, but dangerous. They were the first step on a path that could lead away from a republic and back towards a monarchy. He favored the simple, direct, and unadorned approach. Ultimately, his quiet influence, combined with the firm resolve of the House, broke the stalemate. The grand and flowery titles were discarded. The simple, respectful form of address, Mr. President, was adopted. It may seem like a small victory, but its symbolic power was immense. The sound of a gavel, quietly tapping, signifying the end of the debate, also signified a profound choice about the nation's character. The clear, simple look of the words Mr. President on a printed page became a statement of principle. This choice deliberately and powerfully distinguished the American executive from the kings, emperors, and potentates of the Old World. It reinforced the revolutionary idea that the president was a citizen, not a ruler. He held his office temporarily through the consent of the governed and was not elevated to a separate class of nobility. He was Mr. President, a title of respect for the office, but one that kept the person holding it firmly grounded as a member of the society he served. There is a feeling of quiet dignity in this simplicity, a strength that does not require unnecessary pomp. The soft echo in a quiet room, as the simple title is spoken, is the sound of a truly Republican idea taking root. It became, and remains, a powerful symbol of American democracy. His influence extended beyond these domestic titles and traditions, shaping the very way the new nation would present itself on the volatile and dangerous world stage. Let us now turn our thoughts to the vast ocean, and to a choice Washington made that would guide the nation's course for more than a century. Imagine a small, sturdy ship, its sails full, navigating a careful and deliberate path between two massive warring galleons. Their cannons roar, their flags signal conflict, but the small ship holds its course, committed not to joining the fight, but to reaching its own destination safely. This was the essence of Washington's foreign policy, a precedent of neutrality that was as controversial as it was wise. In the year 1793, the world was shaken by the news that revolutionary France had declared war on Great Britain. This placed the young United States in an incredibly difficult and dangerous position. France had been America's indispensable ally during the War of Independence. The Treaty of Alliance, signed in 1778, was still technically in effect. A great many Americans, including Thomas Jefferson, felt a deep sense of loyalty and obligation to support France in its new struggle. They believed that the cause of the French Revolution was an extension of their own, a battle for liberty against monarchy. On the other side of the argument was Alexander Hamilton. He argued from a position of cool pragmatism. He pointed out that the Treaty of Alliance had been made with the French monarchy, a government that no longer existed. He also argued, with stark clarity, that the United States was simply too young, too weak, and too financially fragile to be drawn into a major European war. The nation, he contended, needed a long period of peace to grow, to mature, and to strengthen its institutions. War would be a catastrophic risk. Washington, in his study, was faced with these two powerful, competing arguments. He saw maps of Europe and the Atlantic spread out before him, with the United States a distant and still developing entity. He felt the weight of the decision, knowing that a wrong move could shatter the nation's hard-won independence. After careful deliberation, he came to agree with Hamilton. His own deep sense of calm resolve told him that the path of peace, however difficult, was the only responsible choice. Survival had to come before sentiment. On April 22, 1793, he issued his proclamation of neutrality. The quiet scratching of his pen as he signed the document was a sound that would echo through generations. The proclamation declared that the United States would be friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers. It forbade American citizens from aiding either side in the conflict. This move was deeply controversial. It angered many pro-French citizens who saw it as a cowardly betrayal of a loyal ally. The nation was fiercely divided. The wisdom of Washington's position was soon vindicated by a chaotic and strange diplomatic crisis. The new French Republic sent an envoy to the United States, a man named Edmund Charles Genet, who history remembers as Citizen Genet. Full of revolutionary zeal, Genet landed in America and immediately began acting as if it were French territory. He ignored the proclamation of neutrality and began commissioning American privateers to attack British ships. He attempted to recruit American citizens to fight for France. His arrogant and inflammatory actions were a direct challenge to American sovereignty and a profound embarrassment to his supporters, like Jefferson. The crisis he created proved beyond any doubt the dangers of foreign interference that Washington so feared. This experience, this close brush with being dragged into a foreign war, deeply shaped Washington's thinking. The principle of neutrality became a core theme of his farewell address just a few years later. He famously warned the nation to avoid permanent alliances and foreign entanglements. This doctrine became the cornerstone of American foreign policy for over a century. It allowed the United States to focus on its own affairs, to trade peacefully with all sides, and to concentrate its energies on westward expansion and internal development. It created a sense of calm and isolation, like the gentle sound of waves lapping against a shore, a peaceful coast far removed from the storms of the old world. Just as he carefully shaped the nation's external relations, his internal method of governance, particularly his use of a close circle of advisors, created a lasting and vital framework for the executive branch itself. Let us consider now an institution that is central to the American presidency, but which is nowhere to be found in the Constitution. Let us reflect on the creation of the cabinet. Imagine a sturdy, round table, a piece of furniture designed so that all who are seated there can speak and be heard as equals. This is the image that comes to mind when we think of the cabinet, a body born not of constitutional design, but of Washington's pragmatic and collaborative approach to leadership. As we have noted, the Constitution makes no mention of a cabinet. It only speaks of principal officers who would head the various executive departments. The idea of the president meeting regularly with these officers as a single advisory group was Washington's own innovation. His initial plan was to consult directly with the Senate for advice and consent on matters like treaties and appointments, as the Constitution seemed to suggest. He made one attempt to do this in person early in his presidency. He went to the Senate chamber to discuss a proposed treaty with a Native American tribe. The experience was awkward, slow, and deeply frustrating. The senators debated and delayed, referring matters to committees. Washington left the chamber in a state of agitation, realizing that this cumbersome process was simply unworkable for the day-to-day business of governing. He needed a more efficient and private source of counsel. He turned, therefore, to his 4 department heads, Jefferson, Hamilton, Knox, and Randolph. He began to call them together for meetings to solicit their opinions on the most pressing issues of the day. The soft, thoughtful murmur of voices in these quiet, deliberative meetings became the sound of a new institution being born. At first, the term cabinet was actually a term of derision. It was used by critics who felt that this small private council mimicked the British cabinet system and was a sign of creeping monarchical influence. But Washington ignored the criticism and continued the practice because it worked. His leadership in these meetings was a model of patient deliberation. He had surrounded himself with brilliant minds who held fiercely opposing views. He did not fear this disagreement. In fact, he valued it. There was a feeling of balance in his method, of weighing different arguments with immense care. He would listen intently to all sides of an argument, first from Hamilton, then from Jefferson. He would often ask his secretaries to provide him with their opinions in writing, so he could study them in private. You can imagine the sight of different handwritings on various opinion papers spread across his desk as he considered his options. The quiet, reassuring presence of a leader who listens intently to his advisors became the model for the presidency. This practice established a crucial precedent that the president is the ultimate decision-maker, but that wise decisions are born from listening to a wide range of counsel. He was the final authority, but he did not believe he was the sole source of wisdom. Over the centuries, the cabinet has grown significantly, from 4 members to more than 20, but its core function as an advisory body to the president remains exactly as Washington first envisioned it. His creation of the cabinet is a perfect demonstration of his pragmatic approach to governance. He was not a rigid ideologue. He was a practical leader who adapted the framework of the Constitution to meet the real-world needs of the office he was shaping. These figures, these places, and these profound challenges all combined to forge the character of the first American president. The precedents Washington set were like quiet seeds planted in the soil of a new republic, which grew into the mighty trees that support its structure today. His choices, made under immense pressure and with no guide to follow, still echo in the halls of power. Thank you for staying with me to explore these gentle reflections. As you continue to unwind, let's drift even further back to explore some of the fascinating details and side stories that surrounded this remarkable life. Let us begin this final, gentle journey where Washington's own heart always resided, on the peaceful banks of the Potomac River. Let us take a quiet tour of Mount Vernon, not as a museum frozen in time, but as it was in his day, a vibrant, bustling, and ever-evolving world. It was his home, his refuge, and his greatest passion. When Washington first inherited the estate, it was a respectable but relatively modest property of 2,000 acres. But through his ambition, his skill as a surveyor, and his keen eye for acquiring land, he methodically expanded it. Over the decades, it grew into a vast 8,000-acre domain, a small kingdom of agriculture and innovation. This expansive estate was not a single monolithic farm. Washington, with his methodical mind, divided it into 5 distinct and separate farms, each with its own overseer, its own workforce, and its own specific purpose. There was the Mansion House Farm, which included the beautiful home itself, the gardens, and the workshops of the artisans. Then there were the 4 agricultural farms: River Farm, Dogue Run Farm, Muddy Hole Farm, and Union Farm. Each was a world unto itself, with its own rhythms of planting and harvesting. To walk through them was to walk through the mind of Washington, the farmer, a mind constantly at work, always seeking to improve, to innovate, and to find a better way. One of his first and most revolutionary decisions was to abandon the crop that had defined Virginia for over a century: tobacco. He saw that tobacco, while profitable, was a tyrant. It demanded immense labor, and, worst of all, it ravaged the soil, leaving it depleted and barren after just a few seasons. Washington, the forward thinker, sought sustainability. He turned instead to wheat. He envisioned his fields not as sources of quick profit, but as a resource to be nurtured for generations. The sight of golden wheat waving in the breeze replaced the broad, soil-killing leaves of tobacco. This was more than a change in agriculture. It was a change in philosophy. To support this new direction, he developed a highly advanced 7-year crop rotation system. It was a practice almost unheard of in America at the time. Imagine a single field and follow its gentle 7-year journey. One year, it might be planted with corn. The next, it would grow wheat. Then, it might be allowed to lie fallow, to rest and recover its strength. After that, he would plant it with crops like clover or alfalfa, which naturally returned vital nutrients to the soil. Then would come another grain harvest, and so on, in a slow, intelligent, and sustainable cycle. He was in a constant conversation with his land, listening to its needs and carefully planning for its future health. He kept meticulous records of this system in his agricultural diaries, noting the successes and failures of each field. His innovative spirit was not confined to the fields. It took physical form in the remarkable buildings he designed. The most famous of these is his 16-sided treading barn. It was a design born of his own practical genius. Imagine this unique, circular structure. It was designed so that horses could be led in a circle on the second floor, which was made of wooden planks with small gaps between them. As the horses walked, their hooves would tread upon the harvested wheat, separating the valuable grain from the straw. The clean, heavy grain would then fall through the slats in the floor, to be collected in a granary on the ground floor below. The soft, rhythmic thud of hooves on the wooden floor was the sound of a brilliant mind solving an age-old problem. It was efficient, it was clean, and it was entirely his own invention. The productivity of Mount Vernon was truly astonishing. The estate was a hub of industry. The gentle, rhythmic sound of a water wheel turning at his gristmill could be heard day and night. This mill ground his own wheat and that of his neighbors into fine flour, which was then packed into barrels and shipped as far away as Europe and the West Indies. He also built a distillery, and it is a surprising fact that by 1799, the year of his death, this distillery was one of the largest producers of rye whiskey in all of America. The earthy, slightly sweet smell of the distillery, a mix of cooking grain and fermenting mash, was the smell of another successful and profitable enterprise. The mansion itself, the beautiful home we recognize today, was also his own creation. He inherited a much smaller, simpler house, and over many years, he expanded and refined it. Its most iconic feature, the magnificent full-length piazza, or porch, was an architectural feature he designed and added himself. This long, open-air veranda, with its simple, elegant columns, stretched across the entire back of the house. From here, the view was, and still is, breathtaking. You can see the wide, placid Potomac River, a majestic and peaceful vista. You can almost feel the cool breeze blowing up from the river through the open columns of the piazza. This was where he would often sit in the evenings, a place of quiet contemplation, the peaceful heart of his bustling world. His mind was endlessly curious. He experimented with dozens of different crops, always hoping to find a new plant that would thrive in the Virginia soil. He planted alfalfa and buckwheat, pecans and potatoes. He was constantly testing new plow designs, new methods of fertilization, new ways of managing his land and his livestock. The entire estate was run with an almost military precision. It was a nearly self-sufficient village. It had its own blacksmith shop, a shoemaker, a textile workshop for spinning and weaving cloth, and a fishery on the river. The population of Mount Vernon was over 300 people in 1799, a complex community of enslaved African Americans, hired white artisans, and overseers. Washington's incredibly detailed management style meant that he knew, through weekly reports, the productivity of each field, the output of each workshop, and the work of each individual on his beloved estate. Of course, the master of Mount Vernon was never alone in his duties. The grand mansion at the heart of this complex world had a mistress, a woman who played a crucial, if often overlooked, role in his life and in the life of the nation. Let us now calmly turn our attention to Martha Washington, the First Lady of the United States. She was a figure of quiet strength and profound importance, a source of stability in both her husband's private and public life. To understand Martha's influence, we must go back to her life before she ever met George Washington. She was born Martha Dandridge, and her first husband was a wealthy and prominent Virginia planter. When he died, she was left a very young and very wealthy widow. In fact, her personal fortune was one of the largest in the entire colony of Virginia. When she chose to marry the young George Washington, her wealth, her land, and her social standing greatly elevated his own position in society. Their marriage was, from the very beginning, a powerful partnership. Despite the status her marriage brought her, Martha never craved the spotlight. Public life was not something she enjoyed. In her private letters, she once referred to her role as the president's wife as being like a state prisoner. She felt the constant scrutiny, the endless ceremony, and the formal demands of her position as a heavy burden. She longed for the privacy and comfort of her life at Mount Vernon, a sentiment she shared deeply with her husband. And yet, despite her personal reluctance, she performed her public duties with a quiet grace and a remarkable effectiveness. She was a warm and gracious hostess. To balance her husband's very formal May Lonely Tuesday levees, Martha presided over her own weekly receptions on Friday evenings. These events were the social heart of the capital. The rustle of silk and taffeta dresses would fill the presidential drawing room, lit by the soft, warm light of dozens of candles. The gentle clinking of teacups could be heard, mingling with the sounds of polite conversation and occasional laughter. She created an atmosphere that was both elegant and welcoming, and her calm, reassuring smile as she greeted her guests put everyone at ease. These gatherings were essential for building the social and political networks of the new government. Behind the scenes, she managed the large and complex presidential households, first in New York and then in Philadelphia, with immense skill and efficiency. But her role as a supportive partner had been forged long before the presidency, in the darkest days of the Revolutionary War. During the war, she spent every single winter at the Army's bleak encampments. She endured the brutal, freezing conditions at Valley Forge and at other winter quarters. Her presence was a powerful boost to morale. She would organize the officers' wives, leading them in sewing circles to mend clothing for the soldiers. Her quiet strength and resilience in the face of such hardship were an inspiration to the entire army, from the lowest private to the general himself. The title First Lady was not actually used during her lifetime. She was known with formal respect as Lady Washington. The term First Lady would only become popular much later. She and George had no children of their own, a private sadness in their lives, but they built their family in other ways. They raised Martha's 2 children from her first marriage as their own, and later, after the tragic early death of her son, they took in 2 of her grandchildren and raised them at Mount Vernon. Perhaps the most poignant act of her life came after her husband's death. Before she passed away, she undertook the difficult task of sorting through the decades of letters she and her husband had exchanged. Then, methodically, she destroyed almost all of them. This was not an act of historical vandalism, but an act of profound love. She was preserving the one thing she valued most, the privacy of their life together. She was drawing a final protective curtain around their personal joys and sorrows. In her time, she was supported by other influential women, most notably Abigail Adams, the wife of the vice president. The 2 women became close friends, sharing the burdens and the unique experiences of being the wives of the nation's 2 highest leaders. Martha's quiet dignity, her unwavering support for her husband, and her graceful management of her public role created a powerful model that would help define the position of the First Lady for all who followed. While the presidential household and the beautiful estate of Mount Vernon presented an image of refined Republican dignity, they were both built upon a complex and deeply troubling foundation. To fully understand Washington and his world, we must now turn, in a gentle and reflective tone, to the most difficult and painful aspect of his life. His role as a slave owner. This is a story of a great man grappling with the profound moral contradiction that lay at the heart of his life, and at the heart of the nation he helped to create. George Washington was born into a world where slavery was a normal and accepted part of the social and economic fabric of Virginia. His life as a slave owner began when he was just 11 years old. Upon the death of his father, he inherited his first 10 enslaved people. From that moment on, his life and his fortune were inextricably linked with the institution of slavery. His status as a major slave owner was cemented through his marriage to Martha. Through her, he gained control of over 80 more enslaved people who were part of the Custis estate. As Mount Vernon grew, so too did its enslaved population. At its peak, in the final years of his life, Mount Vernon was home to over 300 enslaved men, women, and children. Their forced labor was the engine that powered his innovative farms, ran his mills, and built his beautiful mansion. For much of his early life, he seems to have accepted this system without significant question. But the ideals of the American Revolution, the fight for liberty and natural rights, began to sow seeds of doubt in his mind. During the war, his views began a slow but profound evolution. He was particularly influenced by some of the young, idealistic men who surrounded him. Men like his aide-de-camp, John Lawrence, a passionate and outspoken abolitionist from South Carolina. The contradiction between fighting for his own freedom while holding others in bondage became increasingly difficult for him to ignore. In his private letters after the war, he began to express a deep and growing discomfort with the institution. He once referred to slavery as his only unavoidable subject of regret. He came to see it as a moral failing and a threat to the future of the Republic. Yet, this private evolution was not matched by public action. As president, his record was complex and contradictory. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, a law which authorized the capture and return of runaway slaves across state lines. And while living in Philadelphia, the nation's temporary capital, where Pennsylvania law offered a path to freedom for enslaved people who resided there for more than 6 months, Washington took careful legal steps to deny his own enslaved staff that freedom. He would rotate them back to Virginia before the 6-month deadline was reached, a deliberate act to maintain his claim to them as his property. It is a difficult thing to contemplate. A great man, a man of such profound principle in other areas, grappling so mightily with this deep moral contradiction, he privately expressed his desire for some kind of legislative plan to gradually end slavery, but he never used his immense public authority to push for such a solution. He was trapped between his evolving conscience and what he perceived as the political and economic realities of his time. The quiet, somber atmosphere of the slave quarters at Mount Vernon, and the thought of people working under the hot Virginia sun, reminds us of the human reality that underpinned his world. It was only at the very end of his life that he made his final and most powerful statement on the issue. In his last will and testament, a document he wrote himself, George Washington became the only one of the major Slavening founding fathers to order the emancipation of the people he enslaved. The sight of his own handwriting, carefully and deliberately outlining the terms of this freedom, is a powerful and moving thing. In the will, he stipulated that the 123 people he owned directly were to be granted their freedom upon the death of his wife, Martha. He also provided for the care of the elderly and the education and training of the young among them. The legal complexities of the time meant he could not free everyone. The majority of the enslaved people at Mount Vernon were the Custis slaves, who had belonged to Martha's first husband. Under the law, Washington did not own them and had no legal right to free them. Upon Martha's death, they were passed down to her heirs. Washington's final act was a personal one, a resolution of his own conscience. It was a partial and imperfect solution, but it was also a significant moral statement, a final acknowledgement from the father of the country that the institution of slavery was incompatible with the liberty he had fought to create. Washington's life and his complex views were shaped not only by the profound challenges of the times he lived in, but also by the powerful and enduring relationships he forged with the people who surrounded him, from the days of his youth to his final moments. Let us peacefully explore some of these key figures, the men who helped to shape the man. Imagine the warmth of a campfire at a Revolutionary War encampment, the flickering light on the faces of loyal officers, a band of brothers united in a common cause. This was Washington's military family, and it was the source of some of the most important relationships of his life. One of the central figures in this family was Henry Knox, a large and jovial man. Knox had been a humble bookseller in Boston before the war. With a self-taught genius for military engineering and logistics, he became Washington's brilliant chief of artillery. He was responsible for the incredible feat of hauling cannons from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston to drive the British out. Throughout the war and later, as his trusted Secretary of War, Knox was a source of unwavering loyalty and sound, practical advice. The sight of Washington and Knox, two large and imposing men, sharing a moment of quiet camaraderie, speaks to a friendship built on deep and lasting mutual respect. Perhaps the most beloved of all his relationships was with the Marquis de Lafayette, a young, passionate, and wealthy French aristocrat. Lafayette sailed to America to join the revolutionary cause. He and the childless Washington formed an immediate and powerful bond, one that resembled that of a father and a son. The sound of French and English being spoken in easy, affectionate conversation between them was a common one at headquarters. Their bond was deeply personal, and it lasted a lifetime, continuing through decades of warm and heartfelt letters, long after the war was over. And then there was Alexander Hamilton, a brilliant, ambitious, and sometimes difficult young man. Hamilton served as Washington's aide-de-camp for much of the war. He was the pen of the Revolution, the intellect that Washington relied on to draft his most important letters and orders. Their relationship was complex. Washington admired Hamilton's genius, but was sometimes frustrated by his ambition. He relied on Hamilton's mind, both during the war and later as his Secretary of the Treasury, to provide strategic thinking and bold policy. It was a relationship built on utility and a shared vision, a powerful but less affectionate bond than the one he shared with Lafayette. His life was filled with other important connections. Gouverneur Morris, another key founder, was a skilled writer who helped polish the final draft of the Constitution. They shared a practical, nationalist worldview. Going back to his youth, his relationship with his older half-brother, Lawrence Washington, was deeply formative. It was Lawrence's service in the British military that first inspired George's own ambitions for a military career, and his lifelong friend and personal physician, Dr. James Craik, was a constant presence in his life. From the brutal campaigns of the French and Indian War right up to Washington's final moments on his deathbed, he maintained a long and respectful friendship with the elder statesman of the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin. And of course, his relationship with Thomas Jefferson was one of the most complex and consequential of his life. It began with collaboration and mutual respect, but as their political philosophies diverged, it slowly evolved into a deep and painful political and personal estrangement. The feeling of trust that had once defined their partnership gave way to suspicion and rivalry. The soft scratching of countless quill pens, as Washington corresponded with these many figures across decades, tells a story of a man who, while outwardly reserved and stoic, was capable of deep loyalty and affection. He was a leader who relied on the counsel, the support, and the friendship of others throughout his long and remarkable life. Tonight, we have journeyed through the creation of a presidency, walked the unfinished streets of a new capital, and felt the immense weight carried by the indispensable man. From the fire of political battle to the quiet calm of Mount Vernon, we've explored the world of George Washington. He wasn't a monument of marble, but a man of deep character who gave his country everything he had, including, in the end, the wisdom to let it go. Thank you so much for joining me on this story tonight. I hope it has brought you some calm, some insight, and perhaps some peaceful rest. Your support makes this channel possible, and I am truly grateful for every moment you spend here. Until next time, sleep well,